What would you do if your entire city was ordered to evacuate within hours, with flames lighting up the night sky and the threat of deadly chemicals looming over your home? In 1979, Mississauga faced this exact nightmare when a freight train carrying hazardous materials derailed. It led to the largest evacuation in North America during peacetime. Join us as we reveal the shocking story of the Mississauga Miracle, where over 200,000 lives were at risk. Before we dive into the background of this tragic train disaster, I invite you to subscribe this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our train disaster documentaries. Mississauga is a city in southeastern Canada, with a population of about 717,961 people as of 2021. It is located in the province of Ontario, about 14 miles west of Toronto and 25 miles north of Hamilton, right by the shore of Lake Ontario. Mississauga is located along the Milton Line, a railway that runs 31.2 miles from Milton in the southwest to Toronto. The Milton Line, which first opened in 1856, was primarily used for freight trains as part of the busy Quebec City, Windsor Corridor, Canada's most traveled rail line. The track was owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, CP, a company based in Calgary that specialized in freight services. By the late 1970s, CP was strongly against using this line for passenger trains, claiming it would disrupt their freight operations going into Toronto. The accident happened near the center of Mississauga, at a level crossing with Mavis Road. On the day of the accident, Canadian Pacific, CP, borrowed 3 EMD F40PH locomotives from GO Transit, a regional rail service that CP had previously tried to keep off their tracks. The F40PH is a versatile diesel locomotive introduced in 1975, originally designed for Amtrak in the USA. Each locomotive is 56 feet long, weighs 118 metric tons, and can reach speeds of up to 103 miles per hour. The 3 locomotives were used to pull a heavy freight train, known as Train Number 54, from Windsor to Toronto. This train had 106 tanker cars filled with various gases and chemicals, including propane, chlorine, and caustic soda. At the time of the accident, the train was operated by driver Mr. Pruss, with conductor Mr. Nickel and trainman Mr. Krupa. Earlier in the journey, the train had a crew of 4, but due to a staff shortage, the crew was reduced to 3. On November 10, 1979, Freight Train 54 was getting ready to leave London, Ontario, after arriving from Chatham. This was one of several stops along the way, where cars were added or removed, and the train was visually inspected. At the London stop, the train crew conducted the inspection themselves. Since they had to wait for an oncoming train to pass and it was already dark, the engineer, Mr. Pruss, turned on the headlights and additional ditch lights, extra lights closer to the track, to help the yard staff better observe the passing train before they left the yard. After the passing train cleared, Train 54 headed to Woodstock, where more cars were added. The yard staff in Woodstock inspected the train and found nothing unusual, giving it the green light to continue its journey. However, for some unknown reason, the crew skipped a required brake test and accidentally started moving out of the yard before the conductor, Mr. Nickel, was back on board. This forced him to run and jump onto the moving train. When the train left Woodstock, the train measures 1.26 miles long and weighed 9,050 metric tons. According to the inspection reports, everything was in perfect working order at that time. Around 11:30 p.m., Train 54 passed a waiting train near Guelph, about 49 kilometers, 30.5 miles, from the accident site. A crew member from the waiting train, Mr. Dion, noticed some smoke coming from the brakes on a few of Train 54's cars. This didn't seem too concerning since the train had slowed down to 15 mph in that area, and smoke from heavy braking could be expected. So Train 54 continued on its journey into the night, unaware that it was carrying the seeds of a disaster. What no one realized was that one of the older train cars had a serious problem. The journal bearing, a part of the wheel set, had run out of oil due to poor maintenance and inspection. This bearing is a simple mechanism where the axle extends past the wheel and rotates inside a metal cylinder called a journal box. The bearing needs to be submerged in oil to prevent overheating from the friction of metal rubbing against metal. Sometimes oil-soaked rags or cotton pads are also used to reduce friction. During inspections, the oil level and condition of these rags should be checked by lifting a lid on the outside of the journal box. Unfortunately, this critical check had been missed, and with each rotation, the bearing got hotter and hotter, setting the stage for a major accident. As the train approaches Mississauga, residents living near the tracks noticed sparks coming from its wheels. Some witnesses, especially those close to the derailment site, even thought the train might be on fire. However, they weren't sure enough to call emergency services or didn't know how to describe which train they were seeing. What actually happened was that the bearing on car 33 had almost completely run out of lubrication, causing it to overheat and begin melting as the train reached Mississauga. The smoke Mr. Dion noticed earlier was likely not from the brakes, but from this overheating bearing. At 11:53 p.m., as train 54 crossed Burnhamthorpe Road, the partially melted axle on car 33 snapped under the heavy load. The broken axle jammed against the frame of the train car before being violently thrown out as the train continued at about 45 miles per hour. A witness at the crossing saw the red-hot steel axle cartwheel about 50 feet down the road before it landed in their front yard. The train dragged the damaged freight car for about 3 kilometers before it finally slipped out of alignment at the Mavis Road level crossing, causing a derailment. This derailment pulled several following cars off the tracks. The collision between the train cars caused several propane tankers to rupture, igniting the wreckage instantly. As more cars piled up, the fire grew larger, and within seconds, an explosion sent a fireball soaring over 1,500 meters into the sky, visible to residents over 100 kilometers away. The train came to a stop when the pneumatic lines were severed during the derailment. Following a suggestion from Mr. Pruss, who happened to be his father-in-law, Mr. Krupa moved to the back of car 32, right at the edge of the fire, and closed the valve. This allowed Mr. Pruss to refill the system and move the first 32 cars a short distance down the track, keeping them safe from the spreading fire as first responders began arriving at the scene. No one had been killed or injured at this point, with one couple narrowly escaping the fire by just a few feet as they waited at the Mavis Road crossing. Just after midnight, a second massive explosion shook the town. A large 4-axle tanker car involved in the blast was later found over 1 kilometer (3,280 feet) away from the wreckage. Despite the firefighters' best efforts, the flames were nearly unstoppable. 11 of the burning tanker cars contained propane, and even more concerning, one of them held 90 metric tons of chlorine. The fire department desperately tried to contain the fire, hoping to save as many train cars as possible from the flames. By 1:30 a.m., paperwork arrived that helped responders locate the chlorine tanker in the wreckage. They found it engulfed in flames, but it was impossible to tell if it had ruptured. The police knew that if chlorine gas was exposed to intense heat, it could turn into phosgene, a deadly chemical used as a weapon during World War I. In response, 6,000 people in the immediate area were evacuated as firefighters focused their efforts on the chlorine tanker. By 4 a.m., another major explosion occurred, prompting authorities to extend the evacuation order. An additional 26,000 people were forced to leave their homes as the situation became even more critical. By 6 a.m., firefighters are finally able to get close enough to the chlorine tanker to inspect it, and they find a 1 meter, 3-foot hole in its side. The gas is leaking. From this point on, the decision is made to let the propane burn off while firefighters focus all their efforts on cooling down the chlorine tanker with water hoses. As the winds shift throughout the morning, the evacuation zone is expanded multiple times. By the evening of November 11th, nearly 250,000 people have been evacuated. Some residents had to relocate multiple times as even the places they were evacuated to were later deemed unsafe. Mississauga's mayor at the time, Hazel McCallion, announced that the city was closed until further notice, with only emergency responders allowed in the area. This became the largest peacetime evacuation in North American history, a record that stood until Hurricane Katrina hit the U.S. in 2005. In the early hours of November 13th, the fire was finally extinguished, with experts estimating that 68 tons of chlorine gas had escaped into the atmosphere. By 1 p.m., the first residents were allowed to return home, and the prepare to evacuate orders, which had even extended as far as Toronto, were lifted. By November 16th, the last evacuees were back in their homes. Remarkably, no residential houses were destroyed, and no one was injured or killed in the disaster. Once the chlorine was fully pumped out of the wreckage, the site was handed over to investigators. Despite the massive scale of the accident, there were no reports of injuries. Investigators recovered the axle that had been thrown from the train just before the derailment and interviewed various witnesses. With much of the train cars destroyed, their main focus was on examining the axle and figuring out what happened before the fire. They also spoke with the train crew and quickly noticed something unusual. Mr. Pruss mentioned using ditch lights on his locomotive earlier in the evening, but the locomotive he was driving didn't have ditch lights. This, along with a yard worker's observation of unusually short inspection times, raised concerns that the crew might have been operating on autopilot. The investigation suggests that after years, or even decades on the job, the crew might have fallen into a routine, going through the motions without fully paying attention. The report didn't find any evidence of deliberate negligence, but noted that Mr. Pruss was likely unfamiliar with the borrowed locomotives. It's possible he mentioned turning on ditch lights because he was used to working with locomotives that had them, even though that wasn't the case on this particular night. The investigation quickly determined that the accident was caused by the journal bearing on car 33 running out of lubrication due to insufficient maintenance during several inspections before the derailment. Since the cause couldn't be pinned on any specific individual, no legal action was taken. Today, journal bearings have mostly been replaced by roller bearings on Canadian rail lines. Roller bearings are less likely to overheat, although they are more complex. Mr. Krupa was nominated for the Order of Canada, the country's second highest honor, but his nomination was not accepted. However, he was inducted into the North American Railway Hall of Fame for his actions that helped prevent an even worse disaster. The city of Mississauga initially sued Canadian Pacific, CP, for the enormous costs they faced after the accident. However, they dropped the lawsuit when CP agreed to stop opposing passenger services on the line, which eventually allowed GO Transit to introduce the Milton line. As we reflect on the incredible story of the Mississauga Train Derailment and the heroic efforts that prevented an even greater disaster, it's clear that the lessons learned from this event continue to shape our safety measures today. What do you think about the decisions made by the crew that night? Could anything have been done differently to avoid the disaster? Share your thoughts and join the discussion in the comments below.